elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome once again to Society and the State. I'm Brian Hyde along with Connor Boyack, and we're going to talk about property rights. This is one of our favorite subjects because so much of our freedom is predicated on the idea of property rights. And I'm going to backtrack here for a moment, and Connor, I'm going to maybe put you on the spot here. When we say property rights, I don't know what pops into most people's heads, but let's make sure that we're all working from like a common definition. If someone asked you, what do you mean by property rights, how would you explain that concept to them?
It's a multifaceted principle that pertains to the ability to acquire something. So you can get property, you can own it, you can use it in the way that you wish, and then you can defend against others who want to encroach upon it. When we think about property rights, we often think about land, right? Your home, your residential property. It also pertains to yourself. You own yourself. Nobody else owns you, and therefore you can do with your body what you wish, provided that you do no harm to other people. And so it's very much this action, this autonomy that you are able to freely act with the things that you own, provided that you do not negatively impact others.
Okay, a good definition. And it's the idea that you don't negatively impact others means you should be left alone. That should be the default setting for how government operates. So I want to share with you an example of a couple in Maryland. This is a couple in their 90s, Evelyn and David Straley. They have been married for many years. They own their home. She's 91. He's 94. She is wheelchair bound. And unfortunately, the home, which they have owned for many, many years, did not come with a wheelchair ramp. So effectively, to get her out of her home, her husband would either have to lift her down the stairs or have at least two different people there to lift her and her wheelchair down their front steps just so she could get out of the house and go out and do things.
Mm-hmm.
So with that problem in mind, him 94 years old, unable to lift this, there was a problem. And their son, Bob Straley, is a builder. And he said, you know what, I can help you, Mom and Dad. Bought about $1,700 worth of lumber. I mean, they priced out wheelchair ramps, and the best competitive bid they could get was about $5,000. That's a lot for a couple on a fixed income.
Yeah.
But their son said, I can do this for you. $1,700 and a few hours of his labor later, he built a perfectly functional, solid wheelchair ramp for them.
Mm-hmm.
Problem solved, right?
Maybe.
You know where this is going. Because along came a county inspector from Prince George's County in Maryland. And I don't know the circumstances. How did the county inspector get notified? Was it a nosy neighbor or whatever? That's irrelevant. The bottom line is the county building inspector came by and told him, hey, you didn't get a permit to build that ramp. You need to tear it down. Now, at this point, their son said, look, why don't you just have someone inspect it? If there's any modifications I need to make, I'll gladly do it. And the county's answer was no. We have a process here. You tried to short circuit that process, so no. So in a last-ditch effort, the son went, okay, I'd like to apply for a building permit. I'll pay whatever you need for a building permit to get this ramp. Nope. You have to tear it down because you didn't ask us before you built it. And then the county upped the ante by starting a legal case and sending this couple, the Straleys were given notification, you will appear in court or you will face fines and or imprisonment or both. So their son, wanting to spare his parents the trauma of having to go to court over this wheelchair ramp, tore down the ramp. Now they have $1,700 worth of lumber sitting there, and Mom is trapped in the house again.
And doesn't want her husband to lift her, from what I read, right?
Yeah, he's 94 years old.
Right.
He really can't.
Yeah.
So here's my question for anyone who I seriously doubt anybody listening to this podcast is probably trying to figure out, well, let's see, how is the government justified for this? But I'm going to go ahead and ask the question, what problem was solved by the way that these agents from the government approached this situation and denied them the opportunity to utilize this ramp on their own property, purchased with their own money, harming no one, threatening no one, solving their problem, but they would not back down. Did it actually solve a problem?
I never watched the cartoon, but occasionally I would see people post clips for South Park. And there was that, I believe the character's name was Cartman, little fat round fellow.
Foul-mouthed kid.
And he had a line that I'd see people post from time to time where it says, "Respect my authority," right? I think that's what this boils down to. It's ego and it's pride. It's control. And I think, from the inspector's perspective, the bureaucrat, he says, well, he didn't say this, but I can see his line of thinking. Look, if we let you do this, it's setting a precedent. And then other people are going to go do what they want and then ask for forgiveness after and just, pay us off rather than coming through the established process that we've, set up for you, dear citizen. And so I can see from the bureaucrat's perspective, like, no, we have this process, therefore you must follow it. And yet, you got to wonder, that guy's in this situation. There's this elderly couple. The son's doing the right thing by his parents, helping him out. Neighbors aren't complaining. There's a legitimate need here. It's sound construction. What is that bureaucrat really thinking, right? I mean, it's like soldiers for the Gestapo going around. Like, did every Gestapo soldier imbibe from the Nazi ideology, or were there some among them who were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm doing this, and yet if I don't, right, then I'm going to face repercussions. You think about the same thing about soldiers today and police officers today and even bureaucrats. Like, did this guy really think that this was a necessary and good idea? It boggles my mind that there are people who are so indoctrinated by the government that they would take this line as their own and fully believe it.
Agreed. The problem I have, too, is, and this was reported by the same news channel that first broke the story. Once the word got out, guess what Prince George's County officials did? They started backtracking. Well, now, hey, in fact, the guy who was over all the building inspectors there in that county says, obviously we didn't want to cause any problems here. We just something went awry, I believe was the way he said it. Something went awry in how his functionaries handled the situation. But the truth of the matter is, there was inflexibility within the bureaucracy because these people did not first, before utilizing their own property, go to the county, hat in hand, and say, please, sir, may we solve our own problem at our own expense and pay the requisite tribute to you in the form of a fee for permission to do so.
If it please the crown.
Exactly.
May I please build a ramp to allow my aged parents to have mobility?
And someone made a conscious decision to go ahead and initiate legal action against this family of this elderly couple just because the rules said he could. Not because it was the right thing to do.
This reminds me, Brian, of another story I want to share before we kind of dig deeper into the principles in play here. This happened in 2014. His story actually finally went international and had the same shaming effect on the local public officials, which is why I want to bring it up, because there's a connection here. So perhaps, dear listener, you've heard this story before. I've shared it several times and included it in my recent book, Lessons from a Lemonade Stand, because it's so potent on this issue. This was a 90-year-old gentleman. His name was Arnold Abbott. And for years, I think over 2 decades since his wife had died, in her honor, he had been continuing to run the nonprofit that they had jointly worked on to feed the homeless. This was in a town in Florida, and South Florida. He would go to this park. He was there all the time. They would feed the homeless, do this wonderful service. People loved it. And yet the city officials did not want it to happen. So they passed a new ordinance to restrict that activity. Oh, you have to be indoors. You have to have bathrooms. You have to do this, that, and the other, which they knew that this organization, Arnold, was not going to be able to comply with based on how they did their service. And so, of course, they passed this ordinance, and Arnold continues doing what he's done for years, which is now in violation of the law. And so the police show up and shut him down. The media catches on to it. Story blows up. Arnold does it again. He just shows up the next time, keeps on doing it. Media shows up. Now it blows up even bigger. National news. I think there's a third time, hit international news. There's this photo of all of these cops shutting down this service project, right? This outreach effort. And here's Arnold with a plate of food and a police officer holding his arm, pulling him away. You've got cops there filming everything, right? And so to me, it's just such an illustrative picture that here's someone who's actually serving others, doing good things, promoting the peace. And then on the flip side, you have the police who are supposedly doing all that, and yet they are the problem in this particular case. And then, of course, the underlying law that they are sent to enforce. And to me, the same thing happened, Brian. Like, there was so much outrage. Oh my gosh, this wonderful little old man feeding the homeless, and you morons are trying to shut him down and causing all these problems. And all of that outrage caused the city to totally backtrack, right? And finally recognize that they were on the wrong side, and they, were definitely looking bad and needed to at least kind of let things smooth over and blow over, that they needed to kind of take a step back. Now, of course, they can still move forward and regulate all this stuff now that public attention has shifted to something else. But we hear these stories pop up, Brian. My problem, and I guess, and let me ask you, is it seems like few people's takeaway from incidents like this are to understand kind of the property rights principle that you espouse. They look at it in this narrow focus of like, oh, that law is a problem, so change it. But they don't go any deeper. Do you sense the same?
Or they justify it, and they justify it because of the good intentions that were behind that. The reason we have these building codes and the reason we have these inspectors is because we want people to be safe.
Mm-hmm.
How would it be if that poor 91-year-old woman was, trying to roll down this wheelchair ramp and her wheelchair broke through and fell and it injured her? How would you feel then?
Mm-hmm.
But you know what they're doing there, right? I mean, that's in the land of make-believe.
Right.
If we come back to what actually happened, well, she was fine. The ramp was fine.
Yeah.
So good intentions, I'm glad people have them, but when good intentions are backed by government force, they can very quickly become unreasonable. And in the case of, for instance, this inspector who came out there and was so rigid and inflexible with them, I'm sure the guy has a sense of right and wrong, but he also has a sense of what a nice paycheck is like.
Mm.
And that's why he can hide behind, hey, I was just following orders. I'm just following the rules on this clipboard. And it distances him from personal responsibility for the actual harm that's being done in the name of good intentions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and the example that I share on this point, Brian, when I'm trying to persuade somebody on these types of ideas, I say, okay, let's use this example, right? There's this wheelchair ramp. I say, let's imagine you're a neighbor and you consider that to be a danger because of these speculative reasons of what could go wrong. Okay, so you're the neighbor, you have this speculative fear. Are you going to go tear that down yourself? Well, no, right? Are you going to show up and punch the son in the head until he takes it down, right? What are you talking about? No. Are you going to go into their house, steal the son's wallet, take out the cash as punishment, like, haha, I got you? Like, no, are you kidding me? Are you going to grab son by the wrist, take him into your basement, lock him in a room for 3 months as punishment? Like, why do you keep asking me these questions? Of course I'm not going to. Okay, so notwithstanding that you have these concerns and these objections, you are not of yourself going to initiate violence against that person because you think what they did was, are you kidding me? No, we live in a civilized society, right? And yet people are willing to hire a third party, employ and task another individual on their behalf to do that which they are unwilling to do themselves. So if it's wrong, if you consider it morally unjust for you to initiate violence over something like a wheelchair ramp that's actually helping rather than hurting this, aged woman in a wheelchair, if you're unwilling to initiate that violence on your own, then why in the world are you supporting a law that implements that very coercion to which you object, right? And the problem is people are so disconnected. As you say, the bureaucrat with the checklist, right? He's absolved of personal responsibility. He's not thinking through anything deeper other than, look, I'm being told to do this, so I'm going to do this. And so it's systems, it's the state itself that leads people to become disconnected from the morality or lack thereof of their actions.
No, I agree completely. And again, as long as we can cite good intentions, hey, we're just trying to keep you safe, because that kind of seems to be the catch-all. There are a lot of people who are willing to suspend their sense of outrage or even their sense of right and wrong and just kind of, well, okay, there's a reason we have these rules. I love how Eric Peters puts it, and he uses the example of, the guys who were guarding the German death camps. He says some of them had a choice to be there. A lot of them didn't. But the ones who did have a choice, he says, you got to remember, there comes a point where you cannot still be considered a good person and keep doing bad things to other people. And, this doesn't just apply to, Godwin's law. It's not just what the Nazis were up to. You can see that play out in much smaller degrees every day in American society.
I talked about this briefly at the end of our episode on the TSA, episode 103. This idea that the presumption of liberty has been eroded, and we now live in a permissioned society. I was actually talking a few days ago with several other folks from think tanks around the country, brainstorming this idea, at least first trying to analyze it and understand it and figure out what we can do about it, because we've now transitioned from the land of the free to the land of permission slips, right? Like, you can't build a home without jumping through all these hoops, paying, massive amounts of money, having somebody come and give you their blessing, right? Your land, your property, everything else, you're not allowed to do it unless you get permission. You are not allowed to operate a business unless you first get permission, and in many cases have an inspection and all this kind of stuff, right? You are not allowed in many states to educate your own children without permission from the state, right? You are not allowed to travel from one location to another without a license, without authorization, without subjecting yourself to a TSA in the case where you're going to fly. In so many cases, right? Even zoning, like this wheelchair ramp is a perfect example, right? There's, conditional use, zoning regulations, everything else. The bureaucrats will say, well, the presumption is that you are not allowed to do things on your property unless we've said it's okay.
Yeah.
Unless we've declared it to be a permitted use on that type of property, that type of zone that we've arbitrarily drawn lines on a map, then the presumption is that you are disallowed from doing it. And only if we change our minds, give you a variance, give you a conditional use permit, only unless it pleases the crown, will you be able to do something that you want on your own property. So we talk about property rights. We talk about it a lot. We champion it, we support it, et cetera, et cetera. But the fundamental problem here is that we don't have it. It simply does not exist, right? Even on something like property taxes, you can own your house and everything free and clear, and yet you're still paying rent to the government. And if you don't, they'll take it away, right? You have nothing that you can say, this is mine, leave it alone, go. Like, you look at civil asset forfeiture, right? Without criminal charges, the government can just take your property, and sucks to be you. And so that is the conflict. That is the problem I have, Brian, is that we all claim to support and revere property rights, and yet at the end of the day, it saddens me to say that it's a fiction. It doesn't even exist.
Okay, so now the $64,000 question. How do we go about reversing this trend? Because this obviously didn't just happen overnight. It's not like, hey, suddenly we woke up one morning and we're a permission-based society. It's come in increments. It's come on cat's feet. But I want to reverse it. I want to see us return to being able to exercise those freedoms and having the presumption of competence and the presumption that, you know what, Connor, you do own your own property. You own yourself. And nobody else should be stepping up in the name of good intentions or otherwise to use force or the threat of coercion to persuade you otherwise.
So I have a few ideas. I'd love to get yours, Brian. One idea is I think we need people like this elderly couple, their son, to go to jail. I think we need Thoreaus who will spend a little time in jail for an injustice and use that as an educational opportunity. Of course, we're risk averse. We won't avoid it. We got to keep our job, this, that, and the other. But I think absurd situations like this need to be taken to their logical extent to openly show people how stupid this is. Not that this story itself with them not going to jail doesn't still serve that purpose, right? But I think it's going to take people, brave people, kind of, calling the state's bluff and saying, come at me, bro, right? Like, do your worst and let's see what the public thinks about it. I think there also needs to be, as you point out, we incrementally got here. I think we need to at least in some fashion incrementally get away. So 2 examples that we've done here in Utah is passing a law saying that any child can operate a business without any permits or licenses at all. Right, so like you see lemonade stands around the country getting shut down, for not having a food permit or a business license. So we changed the law in Utah to say we're completely doing away with that. You don't have to have any permit, any license. I think, because it's for the children, right, you can get more support for that, but then use that as a precedent to broaden the conversation. We repealed fees for home-based business licenses, so you don't have to pay for a permission slip to, sell stuff on Etsy in your home or essential oils or whatever it is. And, of course, in response to that, many cities have just completely abolished their home-based business licensure programs. So I think we can do stuff like that has an impact, albeit small in the larger scheme of things, and yet is meaningful on its own for those people and can serve as a precedent to say, well, look, we did it here. We're okay with it there. The sky didn't fall. Right? Yeah, sure. Maybe the government lost a little revenue, but is that what this is all about? Right? So we can kind of call a spade a spade. And then I think litigation is the other thing. You look over in the past, different courts, and even the U.S. Supreme Court think of something like occupational licensure, the ability to work in your chosen profession without having to get a permission slip. And in the past, the U.S. Supreme Court has had a favorable ruling at one time where, it said that these common occupations, the very essence of what the Constitution was designed to protect, and there's opportunity, I think, like here in Utah again. This has been done a few other places around the country. We had a woman named Justina Clayton who was braiding hair, and the government cracked down on her for not having a cosmetology license, notwithstanding the fact that no cosmetology school even taught African hair braiding. She was from Sierra Leone, right? She would have to spend 2,000 hours learning things that had no bearing on her ability to braid African hair. She had been braiding hair longer than most of the cosmetology students at these schools had even been alive, right? So she sued with the help of the Institute for Justice, fantastic organization, and she won. So I think we need more lawsuits as well. People not just, Mother, may I have my freedom? Please, legislature, will you spare me, this permit? But I think we need people to be more aggressive in court and defend themselves and fight to hopefully get some favorable precedent. I don't know. Do you have any other ideas of what we can do?
I think those are all good suggestions, and all of them at some level point back to the idea that there needs to be a change of heart in the American citizenry. We need to stop living on bended knee and believing that, hey, we need to ask, someone in authority every time we want to do something. Now, that training to depend on authority or to seek permission from someone in authority, no matter how mundane it is, starts for most people about age 5. And it takes place in a government-run institution. But few people think about the fact that, is that where we learned that? But, think about it. How often today do you raise your hand to leave the room or to say something or to go to the bathroom?
Mm-hmm.
Do bells determine whether or not you can come or go, or do you segregate yourself according to your age and so forth? I know it's for another discussion for another time, but I love what you said about the Thoreau approach, and it's scary. I don't want to go to jail, but I believe there was truth in what Alexander Solzhenitsyn said when he said, to stand for truth is nothing. For truth, you must sit in jail.
Interesting.
But it proves the point. And you look at the case in Laurel, Maryland, with this couple. What did county officials do once their iron-fistedness came out and became public knowledge, and they started getting some backlash? Obviously, it did tick off people, and they were pushing back. This is wrong. Why would you? Well, something went awry. No, it didn't. Your system worked exactly the way it was built to work. What's gone awry, though, is the fact that such a system exists in the first place. All right, I hope it gets your blood pressure up a couple of notches. I hope that it also gets you thinking about possible solutions as well. Thanks for joining us on Society and the State. Stick around. We've got a great guest coming up in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.